Good morning, everybody. How's everyone feeling? It's the third day. It's great. Thank you for joining me, most importantly. I know there's plenty of good sessions, and there's plenty of familiar faces here as well, so thanks everyone for coming along. Hi, Mum. She's not actually here. She's in the Microsoft session, but she'll watch the recording, I'm sure. My name's Marc Jordan. I am the product manager for Firebase authentication at Google, and also work within our cloud identity organization. So largely, I think about how do we give extra security to your customers, to your partners, as well as how do we holistically think about identity at Google. I've been doing that for a while. I was at Okta and Microsoft before that, so identity is kind of the thing that I get a kick out of. And so today I want to talk to you about extending identity in your applications, so whether it be mobile apps or web apps or whatever the case may be, to your customers and partners. So I promise not to do this a whole bunch, but who builds apps for customers and partners? Like who builds mobile apps, those sorts of things? Okay. Who builds apps for their employees or maintains apps for their employees? Anyone? Yeah, a few more people? Okay, cool. So a bit of a split. Sweet. So we've got a packed agenda today. We're going to try and keep this to 20 minutes, and we'll open up for some questions at the end. So first, we'll cover off, are customer identities really that different? We're all just people. Are customers and partners different to employees? And we'll dive into some of that. I want to introduce you to the idea of security without obscurity. I want to talk to you about how can we make our customers, our partners, our applications more secure and earn that trust from the people that are using our services. And finally, I want to talk about dropping in instead of dropping out. So how can you use something that's pre-built inside of your app without trying to, I've been to multiple sessions where I've relearned the OAuth spec and the OIDC spec and all these sorts of things. I don't want to have to put you through that, and I want you to understand that, there are easier ways to do that. So that's kind of my agenda for today. And I want to make sure that you leave here with some actionable things that you can take back. So we look after billions of user identities at Google, and by doing so, we learn things about what makes a successful app. How can you build an app that people adopt, that people use, that people feel secure and safe using? And I want to be able to try and pass some of that on to you to make sure that you think about the user experience first, and then all the technology that sits behind it as sort of supplementary to that. So user experience, user security should be first, and how can we build a secure app behind it that really supports that? So let's dive in. Customer identities are way, way, way different to your employees, and they're different for a bunch of reasons. First, the scale. Second, the experience that they demand. The third is the security around them. And the fourth is really around the types of users, how they're getting access, where they're getting access from. So we'll dive into each of these pillars quickly. So let's first have a look at scale. If you look at the bar graph there, this is the employee count of some leading organizations around the world versus their customer accounts. You may be able to see the little blue lines at the bottom there, but maybe you can't. So to save the eye exam, let's look at that. So customer accounts represent, in Google's case, for example, billions and billions of users. But we have a very small user base, an employee base. And we think about these very, very differently. These other, the examples down the bottom are protecting the innocent from potentially public results, but this is consistent across all of our organizations that we work with. When we look at our customers, we see that they have exponentially more users, and they treat them differently in their consumer space versus their employee space. And so it's really important to keep that in mind. So when we think about employees and employee identities, they have their apps delivered in a really consistent way. They're on SOE workstations, they have group policy applied, they're managed by SECM and SCOM and these sorts of things. Their apps are configured the way they need to be, they log in, they get access. Their SaaS applications have policies and things like that configured. Consumers, on the other hand, they don't have that opportunity. I'm sure all of you in this room, or most of you in this room, have a smartphone in your pocket. You've probably gone to the App Store and downloaded something and logged into it. Now, I don't have the luxury of having some IT help desk I can call if that doesn't work for me, or if the login experience fails, or if there's an ambiguous error that pops up on the screen. I kind of have to go it alone. And so because of that, there's this demand for consumer apps to have a significantly better user experience than enterprise apps. And we're seeing the consumerization of IT inside of enterprise applications, but we're still not quite there yet. I don't know if I might log into to Facebook or something like that, and that experience is very different to logging into some of even these enterprise apps that exist on my phone. And I'll go through some of this in a second, but we find that long forms, confusing experiences, like this introduces fatigue through a sign-up process and a sign-in process. And so there's evidence to suggest that the faster you can make that initial touch point with your application, the more successful your app is going to be. So people will continue to use it and grow trust and build a relationship with your organization you can then build on to make your organization, your app, your services more successful. So as I mentioned, security is completely different as well. I know at Google, we use security keys for everything. So my security key goes into my laptop, I go through the Fido dance, and then I'm into my application or service. And with our Beyond Corp story, I can kind of do that from anywhere. But when we look across enterprise security in the wild today, we see a number of different parameters. We see people using push notifications and OTP. We see people using smart cards and certificates, as well as starting to see the adoption of security keys and hardware security, things like certificates living on TPMs and things like that. I don't know about you, but every application that I log into from a consumer standpoint uses something on the right-hand side. So it uses SMS, uses email, uses security keys. Security questions. And when we look at these, there is a materially different security impact to logging in with the left versus the right. Like the attestation levels here are really, really different. And that's reflected in our breach statistics as well. So in January 2016 alone, 2,658, roughly 2,600 reports to the FTC of people's phones getting hijacked. So someone got their number, put it on a different phone, and then got them to log into all sorts of applications with SMS OTP. The interesting thing here is I sort of showed this to some of my peers and like, that's not that many. The interesting thing is they estimate this is about 6% of reports to the FTC on account hijacking, but less than 1% are reported. So it says 2,658, it's probably more like 30,000 or more than that. That's in the US alone, and this happens all the time. So people call up Verizon or call up some mobile vendor, or they go into the store, they get the SIM card duplicated, they go home and put it in the phone, all of a sudden they've got your number, and then you've been hacked at that point. Finally, a look at diversity. So customers and partners look really, really different to employees. They have really diverse backgrounds. They have different access methods from different mobile devices and things like that, different usage pattern, and above all, different needs. With your employees, you can kind of, you know that they're logging onto a workstation. It might have a certificate deployed to it. They generally log in from the office from 9 to 5. They might go home and work for a couple of hours. But you see these trending usage patterns. For me, when I'm traveling, I log into my credit card account, I log into my Delta app, I log into all of these sorts of things from everywhere. And so how do you understand these signals and make sense of them with a legitimate access versus a malicious access? So it gets really, really complicated when I'm accessing from all sorts of different devices, different locations, without that additional context. And most importantly, I just want to stress this as well. Customers have chosen you in this case. It's not some IT department that the CIO has bought the new hot SaaS application. This is a consumer downloading an app. They've chosen you, and they have trust in you from the start that you're going to provide the service that they want. So you need to make sure you maintain that trust. So keeping them and keeping them happy is your responsibility when you're building a mobile app. So I'm sure you have all seen at least one of this slide. It goes without saying, serious data breaches happen all over the world, every day, all the time. And we need to be better at adopting stronger authentication. So even within Google, we think we do a pretty good job of promoting the use of second factor. We have options for SMS second factor, we have OTP, we have security keys, amongst other things. But even at Google, we have less than 10% penetration of two-factor authentication, and we think that's way too low. When we look at the American population, we also see that less than 12% of users have password management software. So these are the LastPass is the 1Passwords, these sorts of things, where I can randomize passwords and insert them, form fill them into services. And these numbers are too low, quite frankly. The adoption of these services is perceived as being too frictionful. It slows you down, it isn't user-friendly, and things like that. So we need some way that we can improve these security parameters without impacting our users' onboarding experiences. And the evidence is in the data. So we see that 56% of people that we've surveyed, or the people that have been surveyed, haven't signed up to an app because the sign-up experience was too long or too complex. So 56%, more than half of people pick up an app, and if it's too long or too complex to log into it, they just drop it. So your first touch point with a user is completely invalidated at that point. They delete the app, they move on to something else. We also find that 49% of people stop using an application because it's, I have a reauth flow that's really hard, I have to go and find some OTP or something like that. Like, we see massive drop-off on the actual usage of an app if you continually prompt for authentication, if you continually get in the way of them just having a good experience inside of your application. So, does that mean that a secure experience versus a friendly experience is do I have to eat my cake or have my cake, or what is it? We think at Google, it really can be both. And so there's some suggestions, or there's some things that we've learned in managing this huge service that we think are meaningful to the people here. So I'm going to talk about these 4 things. Anonymous accounts and upgrades, and I'll sort of describe what that is. Being more social and using social providers, using federated providers. Listening to risk signals, and then auth, reauth, and two-factor auth. So when I talk about anonymous users, I don't know if you've ever picked up an app and it's just started to work. So there was one I was using the other day that I loaded it up and it said, hey, you can immediately get some value out of this. You can start watching stocks, you can do all that sort of thing. So I was like, oh, this is all of a sudden very useful. And when the time was right, I could then step that up and create an account. So it's really about earning trust. I get value from this application, it immediately provides me some value in my life, and then when I've developed that trust with that vendor, then you can start asking for additional things. There's frameworks around incremental authorization and things like that that can enable you to make that experience even better. What you don't want to do, and I had this experience this week, is download and install an app, and then all of a sudden it asks for full access to all the storage on my Android device. That's really bad, and that, as a security professional, makes me go, well, do I really need this application or service? So it's thinking about that onboarding experience and building that trust with your user base. And just to be clear, when I say anonymous users, I definitely don't refer to never knowing who this person is or not saving their state or anything like that. The major mobile platforms, iOS and Android, web experiences support saving state in things like cookies, serving on the keychain, or persistent app storage. So you still have some idea of who that user is, and when they decide to upgrade their account, you can maintain their user ID and all sorts of things like that, so they continue to have the same access, the same state, the same knowledge of who they were. So my guidance here is offer conversion when it makes sense. If you don't need to store credentials, don't store credentials. And that leads me to federated providers. So again, I could ask you for your username and password and ask you for your display name and all sorts of things like that to fill out this application. But if I can promote the use of sign-in providers like Facebook, Twitter, Google, whoever it may be, that means that you don't need to store those credentials. It doesn't diminish the value of your user store, and you can still associate all the information you might want about that user inside of the user store. And with things like incremental consent and everything else, you can request that information from federated providers when the time is right. So the user isn't fatigued with having to fill out all these fields and things like that. They get into the app, they click sign in with Google or sign in with Facebook, and all of a sudden have access to the application and service, and you get the right amount of data suited to your application. The other thing is, if I'm signing in with Google or some other provider, suddenly that I have all of this security and all of these risk signals that a service like that provides to me. So I still want to manage risk, but I get extra benefit from these federated sign-in providers. So even if you're using a federated provider, you still need to understand risk specific to your application. And so the recommendation here is integrate with risk and analytics streams. So at Google, we see billions of events, and we can start to make assessments of when things look risky. We have investment in Android, in Chrome, even in iOS and some of the libraries that we produce to be able to know when a device is legitimate, to know that I'm not on some rooted device or some jailbroken device, or I'm not using some compromised or some simulator or something like that that might give me interesting results or allow me to undertake account abuse and account hijacking. And I want to give you a quick introduction to risk, but I encourage you to read more about it. And the risk working group essentially is the risk and incident sharing coordination working group. Is really about enabling multiple service providers to work together to understand when an account has been compromised. And so we work really hard to make sure that this is the best experience. And so if we see a specific email address or a specific phone number has been compromised, we feed into this platform to allow all service providers that are leveraging it to get the best of this value. And so you could prompt for a re-authentication or something like that, step up or whatever the case may be. So integrating with these providers like Risk enables you to have a better application using the knowledge of all of the other providers on the internet that are integrated with this platform. And we think it's really, really important to build a safer internet. So build apps, use these signals, make use of the signals, and then step up or step out when it makes sense. And there's the last thing here is auth, reauth, and two-factor auth. So authentication via federation or via a username and password is important. And you should offer trustworthy credential types or trustworthy federated providers that make sense to your app or to your organization. You want to layer on risk-based analytics, as I sort of just said. You also want to make sure you meet your users where they are. There's no sense offering specific providers if you're offering a banking app or something like that. So you need to make sure that you meet your users where they are. If they have a sign-in provider that makes sense, give it to them and make sure that it's being used, monitor the analytics and things like that on it. What we also see is re-authentication. And so I encourage you to check out my colleague Christian's session this afternoon where he talks about WebAuthn and FIDO. But re-authentication could be something like a strong authentication factor like my phone is a security key or some FIDO U2F key or something like that. So I can bootstrap that experience with an initial sign-in, but then make reauth events like where I top up my card or I make a large purchase or something like that really, really seamless. And we think it's important that you do that with a strong factor like web authentication or FIDO standards. So there's a bunch of work going on there in Chrome, across Android, and even in iOS to enable that step up to be attested from something that's backed by hardware security. So a certificate that gets unlocked when I put my fingerprint on gets written to a service backend. And my guidance on MFA is really quite simple. Use MFA, don't do it too often, use strong factors. So my last little section here is about dropping in rather than dropping out. So far we've talked about allow anonymous users and upgrade them when it makes sense. Use social providers, listen to risk signals. Manage epic scale. You want to be ultimately successful, so you need huge, huge scale. Implement MFA, have a great UX, standards, support FIDO, WebAuthn. This is a ton of stuff. As an app developer, having to think about all this stuff is hugely burdensome and hugely time consuming. So we think there are fantastic providers out there that you should leverage in order to do that. We would love it if you didn't go it alone and have some big SQL database on premise that you were trying to manage and maintain and implement all of these things on top of. Especially when we think about sharing and the risk working group and other things where you can get additional benefit from enabling these components. So ensure you have extensibility where it matters. So integrate with serverless, integrate with functions, whatever it might be. Enable extensibility and customization into your platform where it makes sense, but don't customize the whole stack. So you might call out to a function if a specific user signs up or if a specific domain comes in or something like that. Use vendor-supported SDKs for the heavy lifting. Again, don't write your own REST calls against services that exist on the web. There are SDKs out there that do all of this heavy lifting for you. When we talk about authentication, we're really talking about a security stack, and you don't want the opportunity to make some mistake that will cost or compromise your application or your user login experience, both from a UX side and also from a security side. SDKs help you get around that. And so if you're looking at a provider, make sure they have the SDKs that support your back-end server language, as well as the front ends that you're developing for across the major providers. Ensure that there are out-of-box sign-in and security methods that are suited for your app. Again, there's no point offering a federated sign-in provider where it doesn't make sense to your application or service. So ensure that, if you require passwordless, make sure that your vendor supplies you with the ability to do passwordless, or you've implemented inside of your stack using open standards. And finally, don't reinvent sign-up and sign-in flows if you can avoid it. So, you want to offer a fantastic user experience. You don't want to have a user go through 12 different next pages to sign up for an account. We think there are amazing sign-up providers and sign-in providers that can A, solve the complexity, B, offer your users a really great experience, and C, stick to industry standards that people are used to seeing that they understand. So make sure that they trust the login experience, that it's using industry best practices, it's using the right design principles and things like that. And we think there's fantastic providers out there that do exactly that. And it shouldn't be hard. Implementing authentication today should not be a hard exercise. You shouldn't have to understand the nitty-gritty deep principles of any of these standards or any of these compliance principles. Like, you should literally just be able to drop an SDK into your application, uncomment a couple of lines of code, and really offer a really great experience. We know authentication isn't easy, and so we invest a ton of time in trying to optimize that experience, optimize those flows. And an SDK that's suitable for your organization and for your application will really take some of the guesswork out of that. So in closing, I want you to remember, customers are different. You need to provide security to them above all else. And I think, if you implement world-class SDKs, if you implement on top of a standards-based provider, you can really achieve some of those use cases and avoid the sign-in fatigue, the cognitive overload, and all of those things that are involved with signing up for a new service and getting onboarded. That's it. I've got a couple of minutes left. I'll open it up for questions if anyone's got any. Great question. I will speak for Google in that we have a highly available service, but an individual user account may vary. What you can offer is multiple different methods to sign into an application. And so at Google, we call that account linking. So I might have my Google sign in, but I might also have a phone authentication thing that's tied to that same account. So if my Google account was to be locked down or something like that, I could sign in with my phone number and still have the same user ID in the back end and have the same state. So we think offering users choice. The important thing to factor in there is making sure that you bootstrap both of those experiences at an attestation level that is right for your organization. So maybe if I think about different attestation levels, Google might sit at one specific level and phone authentication might sit at a different one. You don't want to allow an attacker to find sort of the easiest vector to get in, and so making sure that they pass whatever principles they need to get through your front door is important. So account linking, but also provide security on top of that. Thanks, great question. Any other questions? Cool. We've got about a minute left if anyone's got anything. Otherwise, I'll let you escape and get some coffee. Cool, thank you.